was fascinated by the history of the club, going back to its origins in the 1950s, and the fact that I think Stephen's father led a delegation to China and to open up Chinese relations at a time when that was deeply unpopular and quite difficult. And the fact that the club has continued, I think, is quite extraordinary. I think it's a very useful development. It's a very helpful conduit for developing relationships with Chinese institutions, Chinese companies. So I'm very impressed by the 48 Club and its longevity, which I think is a Chinese factor. Within the Blackstone Private Equity Group, I have two principal roles. The first is to work with our investment teams on the management of our portfolio companies, mainly in Europe, but also to some extent in Asia. And secondly, I sit on the investment committees looking at new investments in Europe, in Asia, and to some extent in the United States as well. Yes, I think the whole trend of socialism with Chinese characteristics as led by President Xi is very interesting. I think the key reforms that interest people like me and firms like Blackstone relate to the opening up of the markets. Giving the markets, I think, a decisive role as opposed to a more passive role is a really important development. Of course, as long as it's followed through. And key developments like opening up the banking sector to private banks, encouraging the investment of private capital into SOEs or alongside SOEs. These are very important developments and potentially really significant for China. For China to become more efficient, more competitive is really important, and that includes the financial sector as well. So opening up financial services generally to private sector involvement to a greater extent, to foreign investment, where we can see best practice being imported into China to help Chinese institutions develop and grow, particularly in areas like transparency and governance, would be really important. I also think that the development of a more robust and independent regulatory infrastructure is also really important for China to give confidence to investors, both domestic investors and foreign investors, the confidence they need to invest in China for the long term. I think that's really important. I think firms like Blackstone, I'm particularly focusing on my area, which is private equity, can help a lot in terms of the development of Chinese business generally, and specifically perhaps in financial services. And I think of areas like governance, like best practice for management, like helping Chinese companies develop overseas, as more and more are doing. I think these are really important contributions that firms like Blackstone can make. And we're particularly focused on the service sector, for example, on consumer goods, on telecommunications, those kinds of markets. We're also in our real estate area interested in investing in, and in fact actively investing in, areas that would support that thesis. With greater liberalization will come some increased volatility. I think that's inevitable. But overall, I think I expect the currency to be stable. Okay. I think the differential between Chinese growth and world growth, or growth in the other currencies, principal economies like the dollar or the euro, is such that the Chinese currency should remain strong for the foreseeable future. Perhaps not quite as strong as it's been in recent years, given the appreciation of the RMB over the last 20 years. I think it has appreciated very steadily, and particularly in the last few years with the downturn in the Western economies. So perhaps not quite as strong, which I think would be a good thing for China, not a bad thing. China for centuries was the largest economy in the world, the biggest country in the world, and it is at the point where it will resume that status over the next 20 years. So my dream is that China achieves that ambition, that goal, with a positive development inside the country, where that development is good for all Chinese people, not just a few, and where the development takes place at an acceptable cost in terms of the environment and in terms of China developing alongside its internal dynamics an external presence which is also a force for good for what will become the world's largest economy. I think the dream is that China becomes the biggest economy in the world and also the most powerful economy in the world in terms of some key issues that face all of us, including climate change and the development of the African continent, for example.
Thank you so much. Best of luck for your speech today.
Thank you.
Thank you.